Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors and other inspiring guests, doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm speaking to Dr. Pragya Agarwal all about motherhood, gender-based stereotypes and biases, infertility, and so much more. In her book, Motherhood, on the choices of being a woman, Pragya shares her own journey of becoming a mother at a young age and then facing years of secondary infertility until her two beautiful twin daughters were born through surrogacy. It's a phenomenal book, focusing on intersectionality, offering us a perspective that merges race, class, and other elements of identity when talking about motherhood and infertility. Dr. Pragya Agarwal is a visiting professor of social inequities and injustice at Loughborough University, writer, speaker, and consultant. Following a Ph.D. from the University of Nottingham, Pragya held the prestigious Leverhulme Fellowship and has held senior academic positions and visiting fellowships at various US and UK universities. She is the author of a number of scholarly articles and 4 non-fiction books. Just a little trigger warning. In this episode, we talk about some difficult topics including infertility, IVF, abortion, and baby and pregnancy loss. So if you need to return to this episode at a later date or skip it altogether, please do. I'm so glad Pragya is my guest today. Hi, Pragya. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show today. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about your work. But how are you?
Thank you so much for having me here, Samia. It's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Yes, I'm really good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing really well. And yeah, I'm so glad that we could sit down. I think this is going to be absolutely amazing conversation. I am honestly really in awe of your work. And the book that I want to focus on today is actually Motherhood, which I know is not your latest book. You have fairly recently out a book called Hysterical, Exploding the Myth of Gendered Emotions, which also sounds fantastic. So I will make sure that I read that one too. But I'm interested really in exploring some of the themes that you've written about in Motherhood on the choices of being a woman. If you wouldn't mind, what led to you deciding to write this specific book? What made you interested to write about motherhood, and then also this particular book, the things that you've written about, and also the style, because it's semi-memoir but it's also really informative, lots of research. It's a really interesting mix.
Thank you so much. Yes, the book came out in hardback in 2021, which seems like a long time ago. But I started writing it in 2019 after I finished writing my first book, Sway. As to why I thought about writing this, I think it was initially for myself to own my story in a way, to make my motherhood and mothering visible, because I felt like for a very long time it was something I wasn't talking about openly, about the motherhood struggles or even the struggles with fertility or reproduction or mothering, just everything about my body. I felt like I was coming into my body as I was growing older and taking ownership of it more, not being led by what people had told me I should believe in about myself and my body. And so it started off like that, me thinking that I needed to own this story rather than trying to hide it away for a number of reasons, which I explore in the book, about shame or stigma or guilt or things like this conflict or paradox between your professional identity and your personal identity, and how you have to keep them separate, all those kind of things. So I think that's where it started about trying to write. Another reason was that I started thinking a lot about motherhood, ventured into Instagram, and I was looking at a lot of kind of motherhood through performative motherhood through Instagram and social media as well. And at that stage, now it's changing and evolving, but at that stage, I was thinking in magazines or even in other memoirs or books or on Instagram or other social media, motherhood was, there was a specific very distinctive face of motherhood, public motherhood even, which was very white, middle class, hetero. And I felt like people who were marginalized or often on the fringes were still being othered even in their motherhood. And so that's where the kind of motherhood, the title comes from, the otherhood and motherhood, that we didn't weren't seeing people like me, a brown in mothering. But then there are other intersections which I explore in the book as well.
Mm.
There's a long response to your question about what prompted me to write the book. And then your second question was about this form that it took. So I'm basically a researcher at heart, an academic. A lot of my work is led by the kind of research I do, the stats, the data, everything that's happening in research. And I wanted to focus on this idea of reproductive justice, which we weren't talking about. Even when we're talking about reproduction, we're talking about Roe v. Wade, we're talking about abortion, we're talking about infertility. I wanted to bring it all within this framework of reproductive justice and how your identity shapes the choices that are on offer to
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And have to say, I think the reason why I felt such an affinity with this book primarily is because it's written by you, a South Asian woman, also who I know you had your first child very early on, but you became a mother for the second slash third, because there's twins,
you.
time later on in life, and also through after years of infertility and then through a process of surrogacy, which we also don't talk about. And there's so much intersectionality in your book, which I think really speaks to my personal experiences, but I think also those of so many others, that it feels bizarre for us to talk about something like motherhood and infertility or reproductive systems and reproductive justice without also understanding how that is impacted by race, by class, also by the way that you were brought up. And yeah, and so I think for that reason, I really appreciated it. And I'm also South Asian, and I have found, and again, I think it is changing slightly, but we don't talk enough about these things. And as someone, I'm not a mother yet, but I'm having like a really tough infertility journey, and it can feel so lonely
Mm,
if the majority of voices that you are hearing talking about these things are people that you don't find that much affinity with. There's so many nuances when it comes to cultural and experiences, especially in the UK, that are impacted by politics and society, that impact the way that you go through this journey in a very different way. So I really appreciated that. You talk about your early life as well, like your life as a child. And I think one of the really like somber and almost like heartbreaking things to read about was your relationship with your father. And again, I think this is something that we also don't talk enough about, the relationship that girls, particularly from certain communities, have with their fathers when there is such a patriarchal
mm,
society, and the way that can put a strain on a relationship sometimes, and then the long lasting impacts of that. And you write about the fact that growing up, you really felt like you wanted to be your father's son because your father didn't have a son. But also, there was such a change in your relationship with him when your period started, and you somewhat, I don't know if like he moved away or you moved away, but there was this distance. And I wondered if you could just speak to that experience and what you really hope people will understand about that.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey as well with me, Samya. I think it's really, I think, heartwarming to hear when your story resonates. And as you say, I think first of all, I think I'll say yes, it is a very lonely experience when you don't
Mm,
see yourself. And I think part of the reason I wrote the book was also because when I was going through the journey, all the images that I saw, all the forums I was on, I'd never heard a story like mine, and it felt like maybe I'm the only one that is struggling,
mm,
and that's a very lonely experience, I think, to have. But talking about my childhood, yes, it is a very and things are changing, as you say, but that the community, the culture is very patriarchal, and in some ways we seem to be regressing as well because
mm,
of a number of reasons there. But I think the desire for a son really dominates the society, the community. The parenthood is really dictated by having a son, because that son's going to take care of you, is going to light your funeral pyre, is going to uh, help you achieve salvation or whatever in your next life. So I think when you're one of three sisters, I was one of the eldest as well, in particular, that the burden of being the oldest child, but also knowing that I have to somehow compensate for the fact that they didn't have a son. And also this kind of eternal, I think from a very young age, I've had this kind of struggle within me, saying, I am no less than a man. Why should I be
Mm.
less than anybody? Why should I be not enough? I think that's something that came from within from a very young age. I can do whatever everybody else can do. And I think that has dominated so much of my life, but also my childhood as well. And in some ways, I think parents like my father or my mother, who were really open minded in a lot of ways, and my father, especially, as I talk about in the book, distributing sweets when his third daughter is born, when everybody else is paying him condolences, which is in fact a strange thing, and that they didn't have a son. He also, there is some internalized patriarchy and misogyny as well, which people find it difficult to get rid of. It comes out in a lot of ways. Yeah, so I think that relationship was very strange, but also very unique. We were very close, but also not close in a lot of ways, which I realized after his death. And also, we don't talk enough about, I think, masculinity in these cultures and how it is
Mm.
determined. And that's a big conversation in itself, but also the loneliness that men might encounter because they're supposed to be the ones to take care of everything. The burden is placed on their shoulders. And my dad never talked about his emotions in a way, but also was very open with his emotion in a lot of ways, which that inherent paradox. And I think he struggled with that. And then when he died and we were looking through his things, and still I find the poetry that he had written, and that showed me a different side to him, things that we I didn't know and I never asked, things that I didn't know
Mm.
about him, how he felt. My first child was born, he wrote these poems for her, and I
Oh.
found them recently when I was just going through some papers. And I think that is something, is because of this inherent patriarchy, which tells men and women how to be, that women have a certain role to play and men have a certain role to play, and where everybody feels inadequate, where in a lot of ways
Mm.
where they're not being able to perform those roles.
Yeah. Yeah, because any society that's based upon somewhat fixed gender
Yeah.
roles, it doesn't just impact one of those, or one of those genders. And you're absolutely right. I do often worry somewhat about, especially like boys growing up, but men in general, because although we've been saying like, oh, we don't talk about this issue and we don't talk about that issue, but men don't talk about anything in, particularly in the South Asian culture. It's really unheard of, and that is very dangerous. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to go back a little bit and talk about infertility in your experience, but also some of the things that you've written about and you've learned through your research. I think it's such a complex experience and so specific to individuals as well. I feel like no two people's journey is the same. It doesn't start the same, it doesn't end the same. Whatever you decide to go through, whatever happens, is very different. But I think there's always so much loss and grief, whatever that looks like and whatever has happened. But there's also shame. And I think this comes back down to, in part, the ideas that we have about whether or not our bodies are failing us or whether or not we are fulfilling the roles that we should have as mothers or future mothers or daughter-in-laws or daughters. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that and how you perhaps over time navigated it, or now with hindsight look back at that element.
Yeah, you're so right about this kind of internalized shame. And if I look back and I think it wasn't my fault. It
Mm.
isn't my fault. It is nobody's
Yeah.
fault. But I think yeah, partly something we see or hear growing up. Even then, even when as a young person, kept on saying I don't want to be a mother, because I wrote about it in the book. I thought about motherhood as a particular model, and I didn't want that to conform to that model. And also, the shame also comes from what we just mentioned about the loneliness of it all, not seeing other people, not talking about it openly, not hearing other stories. you feel like everybody is okay. I'm the only one who's going through it. So, how do I talk about this? I think there are some wider societal aspects of it as well. Brown and black women have traditionally, because of racism or racialization, have been seen as hyper fertile, which means that they have big family, they can easily reproduce, they have children very easily, which also affects how medical domain sees brown and black women. First of all, there is a lot of reluctance in our community to go to the doctor, even or with infertility struggles, or to be
Yeah.
open about it, because you don't want to tell your mother-in-law or your wider circle, or what would people say is a big thing. But also, I think within the healthcare or medical domain, there is not much awareness of how it impacts black and brown bodies. And there is still this kind of perception that they are okay, they can give birth really easily, they have large families. And so there's these two sides of the coin about who goes to the once you don't have the trust within the medical domain, then you're more reluctant, even more reluctant, to go about how you're going to be
Mm.
treated, whether I'm going to be racialized, whether I'll face racism, whether I'll face stigma, whatever, all those kind of things, how will I be treated? So you don't go to the and step into it. Then I think my first child was unexpected. And so when I faced infertility the second time around, we don't have much awareness within the research domain, but also wider societally, about secondary infertility. Nobody
Yeah.
talks about secondary infertility, because once you've had a child and you can't conceive again, it's very difficult to articulate the grief of not being able to do that again. Even with me, I think a few people that I shared the fact that I was going through IVF were really surprised that I was trying again. That why would you need to go through all that trouble again when you already have a child? So it's not, it's almost like you're being too greedy and
Mm.
expecting too much and doing all that. Okay, so yes, I think secondary infertility is something we don't have much awareness of. And so it's really hard to say, oh, I am doing it, I'm trying again. And also, I think you put so much pressure on yourself because you think, I've had a child easily once, so why can't I do it again? What is wrong with me? You feel guilt because you can't easily do it, and you have to go through all the trouble and the hassle, and your partner has to go through all the trouble and hassle, and the financial and the emotional and the physical impact of it. Financially, it can be a burden because, as we know, IVF in the UK is a postcode lottery, depending on where you live, whether it's available on the NHS. If you already have one child, you can't get it free. Even if only one of you in the partnership has a child, you can't get it free, any of the IVF cycles. So you have to go private, you have to pay for it. And that is a huge financial burden. Not everybody is able to do that. So I think, reflecting on my journey, there were a lot of aspects to it in terms of me already having a child and it's being secondary infertility. Secondly, the financial, emotional, physical impact of it, and me feeling really guilty about the fact that we had to go through it because my body was failing. It was nobody else's fault. It was me who wasn't able to do it. Did I? And then this fact, like, why am I doing it? What is the
Mm.
reason? Why can't I just give my husband children easily when he so
Mm.
desires them? If he was with somebody else, he would not go through all this trouble. All those kind of things come to your mind. And I think those kind of internalized ideas of what your bodies are expected to do and what your bodies are supposed to do, and then they don't do that, and you think, am I an anomaly? What is wrong with me? But there are also medical terms which really stigmatize a lot of these things like
Mm.
a tilted uterus, or all those kind of things which associate with the failings of your body. And they make you feel, even every time you go to the doctor and talk about it, your body is talked in terms of something detached from yourself, like you have no association with your body in a very pragmatic, practical sense. But the terminology that's used makes you feel like a failure. And I think
Mm.
that is the biggest issue. Um, So I think there was a lot of these things that when and so I created this silence around it, and the more this you create this silence around it, the more it develops from there. So I didn't even share it with my mother, for instance. I went through IVF cycles. I was in the UK, she was in India, and so I felt completely lonely. I wasn't talking to anybody about this, and people just assumed we didn't want another child because we were going through these 5 rounds of IVF. But it had a huge mental health impact on me, and also professional impact as well. And also in workplaces, I think I found you have and it's changing as well again. But at that time there was this perception that you have to keep your personal life out of your professional domain, otherwise
Mm.
you're seen as not being taking it too seriously. And so if you're trying for a child so keenly, especially going through IVF, that means that you can't be serious about your academic career. And so I had to keep that out of that, despite what everything I was going through. So there was this silence that we create is because of the kind of expectations that are placed on our bodies from outside, but also from within us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am so glad that you have written so much and spoken so openly and clearly about secondary infertility, because I don't think a lot of people understand the almost like the depths of it, and understand how painful it is emotionally, let alone physically and financially and all of the other stuff. Because it's interesting, because as I guess someone that's going through like primary infertility, if you even want to call it that, sometimes I do feel like, but it must be easier for somebody that already has a child. And obviously, like from reading your book, but also just thinking and being a bit more kind, like it's unfair to make such a statement or to assume such a thing, because and you write about it in the book that you had this feeling of, you had your first child that was completely unplanned but so easily,
Mm,
and then to see that it wasn't happening for you again, to have this sense that not only I have the sense that my body isn't working in the way that it should,
mm,
but I've always had that feeling. I haven't had the sense that something has happened
mm.
and it has broken.
Yeah.
And so I haven't like blamed myself
Mm.
I blame myself in other ways, but I haven't blamed myself that I've done something in order to break my body
Yeah.
after it having worked. It's just so different and so nuanced. And I think a lot of women, because I have friends that have spoken about how difficult, how much they really want a second child and how difficult they find it. And I think that, and I hope that a lot of people will find comfort and support in your work and in your words, because again, I think because, as you said, like there is the sense that, oh, am I being greedy? I
Mm.
think also those that are experiencing it don't really know how to handle that. Also, there's like an added level of guilt that, but
Yeah.
I already have a child. And especially if you're talking to somebody that doesn't have a child,
Yeah.
I think it can be very complex in that terms, that like sense of guilt and another layer of shame.
Yeah.
Um,
I think what
yeah.
you're saying is really is yeah, I think it's a really interesting perspective because first of all, you feel like if I hadn't had that abortion, then maybe I would be able to go again. Why did I have that? If I had been more fitter, if I'd exercised more, if my diet was this, if I had done all these things, then I wouldn't have broken my body, or if I'd done things
Yeah.
differently. But also I think we place value judgment on love and how love is supposed to manifest
Mm.
in, like, your love for, or your desire for your first child, or your desire for your second child, or your desire for your third child, how how important these things are. We arrange them in hierarchies, I think, as a society, subconsciously. How much we love our pets, how much we love our parents, all those kind of things, we assign value judgments to them. And I think that is natural to do, but that creates barriers and divides as well.
Yeah, and it almost feels like sometimes when we talk about motherhood, we almost feel like once you've become a mother, like that's it. Like
Mm.
it's okay if you don't have more than one child, or it's okay if you have like seven, but you're a mother, you're a mother. Like that seems to be like the end of it. But actually, it's not so simple. It's not, you don't, yeah, it's not, it's more complex than that. But it's interesting the ways in which we simplify it in our minds. And society does not help in that. It does not give us the space to talk about these wide range of experiences that are so painful.
Yeah.
Because yeah, like when I think about my own experience, I think I do blame myself a lot. Like I often think that, oh, in the same way that you just spoke, that, oh, if I was more healthy, if I was slimmer, if I got married when I was younger, if I hadn't focused on my career, if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't done that. And that self-talk is so harmful. It doesn't help one situation, but it also, the emotional toll of that on top of the everyday experience every month, if you have a regular cycle and you
Yeah.
get a period every month, that pain. But then if you don't get a period, that struggle of feeling like, but
Yeah.
I'm not even having a period, like it's just so complex.
But also, I
um
think there is an additional side to it about the misogyny that's embedded within our
mm,
medical domain as well. Because when we
yeah,
go to the doctor, often it's made to feel like it's your fault. First of all,
yes,
either you're overreacting, but it's your fault. You could do
yeah,
something about it and fix it all.
yeah,
Basically, if you wanted to fix it, you could have fixed it somehow. So even
mm,
now, if I go to them and talk about pain or chronic pain, they were like, "Oh, have you tried yoga? Or have you tried to
mm,
lose weight? Have you maybe just walk more, maybe just climb stairs more?" And so the first thing, the onus falls to you about trying to fix it. And I think we internalize it so much because our society keeps giving us these messages that it is
yeah.
your fault if there is something wrong with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially as women of color,
Yeah.
there's added layers about judgments that people make
Yeah.
about family structure, about food, about all kinds of stuff that just makes it even worse. And you're right, like I know how much I hesitate before going to see a health professional, and how nervous and anxious I feel. And I have had some bad experiences, and I know people that have had some absolutely awful experiences as well, which is just such a shame.
Yeah.
So you've written so much about your, especially in this book, about your life. How did it feel to share so much of your personal experiences, some absolutely heartbreaking things that you went through, all that loss and grief and pain and the struggles and your first marriage, and then obviously like you made a very difficult decision at one point to have an abortion when you just weren't ready for another child. Yeah, how did it feel to write about all of this, and why do you think it was necessary for you to do?
I have mixed feelings about it, but I do think that the more less we talk about things, the more silence we create, the more we impose
Yeah,
shame, stigma, guilt, all those kind of things on these experiences, which can be bridges between different people, which can act as like these shared moments where you'd say, actually, you're holding somebody's hand across this divide. There's so many people who've sent me messages, who've sent me voice notes, and just telling me how much they cried reading the book, how much it meant for them because this first time they've seen themselves in a book like this. And I think that's worthwhile, even though part of me feels a bit torn about letting things go and being in the public domain where you feel like you can be judged for many of the decisions you made. I think when I was writing it, I was very conscious that I was writing my story, and I didn't want to articulate anybody else's experience who was linked to me, not even my husband's or my elder child. I was very conscious that my children, now twins, who would read might read the book one day, and so I wanted to make sure I didn't write anything that would impinge on their privacy, or that's something they wouldn't know or they would find out. I didn't want to say, actually, I wanted to just tell my story. And so I was very clear about the boundaries I laid down around the writing as well, about what I was okay to share and what I did. We don't share everything. I didn't share everything, even though it seems like a very open book. So I have had very clear boundaries around it. And I stuck to it even through the editing process, even when I was asked, can you tell me more about it? Even through the publicity, when I was asked to do interviews about certain things, I was like, no, I'm not going to talk about these things. So I think that seems
Mm.
difficult, but I think that was important to me about letting my story go from me, all
Yeah.
these intimate details into the public domain. And I think it does mean a lot to just, it means it feels liberating as well in a lot of ways to finally let it go and not hold it all within inside me, and to see the kind of discussion it's encouraged, the kind of other books that have been inspired by it and alongside it, the kind of other stories that are emerging because of it or alongside it, and the kind of conversation that it can inspire and encourage as well. So I think it feels important to talk about these things. And yeah, so I think there are a few things that I kept in mind during writing it, but I don't regret it and I don't regret it as a whole. I think I see this as a really valuable experience.
Yeah. And you wrote the book also somewhat in hindsight. So it's not like diary entries from the time that you were experiencing it. What do you really, looking back, what do you really wish you had at that time? I think particularly through the IVF journey, I think you had 5 cycles that were not successful.
Mm.
What do you really wish you had available to you at that time in terms of support or literature that could have helped?
Yeah, I think community would have been. I wish I had personally reached out to build a community, but
Mm.
also I wish there were other people talking about it as, and also not just personal stories. I do feel like data is also missing in this. You just saying, I rely on data a lot, some often to make these
Yeah.
emotional decisions. And if I ask the doctor, what is the success rate for this? And nobody has
Mm.
any kind of data about it. What's happening with my body? I want to get some objective information about it. And there's such lack of knowledge and information. I wish as I was growing up, I had more knowledge about my own body, about what was happening, what is likely to happen. I wish people had talked about,
Mm.
okay, it's infertility happens, you might not be able to conceive at one point, and all the
Mm.
myths that are around it. Things like, oh, have acupuncture. If you're not having acupuncture, you're hampering your IVF cycle. If you're not drinking pineapple juice, then you're not going to get this. You get a lot of misinformation from forums. I wish there was something more reliable that I could have read, and around data and stats and also community and personal experiences, to say it's okay, these things happen, it's okay what you're going through, it's okay if you're feeling like this. And often, because I was the oldest child, oldest daughter, I grew up this kind of self-sufficient way that I can't show weakness to
Mm.
people, I can't divulge personal information, I can't let people judge me, I have to be strong for myself and for everybody else. um, it led to me keeping it all quiet and saying, I'm coping with it. I have nothing going on. Like, I am not weak. I am in control. I am not emotional about it. I'm just going through it.
Mm.
I had let myself be a bit more vulnerable and open to these emotions that I was experiencing at the time and say, I'm struggling. That's a
Mm.
huge thing for me to say, I'm struggling, which I only learned to say recently. So
Yeah.
I think it's really important to be able to say, I am struggling, this will help me, this, and be able to find that. So I think in hindsight, that is what, and I think the conversation's changing as as
Mm.
you're talking about this now. Other people are talking about it. There are other motherhood books that have come out, even though there's still a lack of intersectionality in a lot of these conversations. I do feel like we are opening up this conversation and we are talking about the struggles and challenges and barriers, which means that it could help other people. Even when I was writing the book, for instance, I reached out to the association which captures data around infertility and IVF in the UK, and they hadn't desegregated the data according to the ethnicity. So I had no data on Black and Brown women, even at that stage in 2020,
Mm.
which I think was a huge is a huge barrier in trying to understand how many other people have gone through it. What is the success rate? Because people's bodies are different. What is the success rate in this particular community? What is the barriers to this particular community in coming forward and even talking about it? So I think there are social, cultural, political aspects to it, scientific aspects to it, all those kind of things. I think we need to overcome. There's still a lot of barriers around these things.
Yeah, absolutely. This question I think is a little bit sensitive, so please do tell me if you don't want to answer it. We have spoken a little bit about like loss and grief. And I know that your twins were born through surrogacy. When I think about my own experiences, I don't imagine a time that I will like ever forget what I'm going through, regardless of whether or not I become a mother. And I imagine that this will impact my parenting, it will impact my relationship with other mothers, I think it will just it is changing me. And I think it has just, yeah, I think it will dictate in so many ways the parent that I really hope one day I will become. And I wondered if you could speak about all that grief and loss that you experienced, and then how, I guess, you processed that and what that meant for when you did become a mother to your twins. Because that doesn't just go away.
Yeah.
But I think people that don't go through anything like this, they can sometimes have this idea that, oh, but you don't need to think about that anymore. You don't need to feel sad, or you don't need to hold on to that grief because you now do have two
Yeah.
beautiful children.
Yeah.
But that's really is very difficult, I think.
I think it's very true that, and that happens with a lot of parenting. The moment you become a parent or a mother, you're told to focus just on what you have in front of you. Everything else has just stopped or doesn't matter. You can't even say,
Mm.
I'm actually struggling right now, let alone the traumas of the past. Because,
Mm.
oh, look at them. Even now, when I say, oh God, it's such a struggle, I have to constantly qualify. I do love my children a lot, even though it is a
Yeah.
struggle. But yes, as I said, I think I did not acknowledge for a very long time the kind of trauma that becomes embedded in your body and your mind, everything that you go through. So, from my childhood, every experience changes you, but also this experience of the grief and loss every time, even though you put it aside and move on, it changes you in some way and it stays there, remains there in your body, your cells, somewhere, somehow. What happens is this cumulative trauma is that one day it all either comes out in many different ways, or you face burnout and exhaustion or
Mm.
other side effects to it. I don't think it has changed my parenting in any way or my mothering, which is, it hasn't. I feel like I don't think about it a lot when I'm mothering them. It just is what is right now naturally just happening to me. I don't ever think they need to feel grateful to me that I invested so
Mm.
much in their being here in this world, or that they owe me anything, or that I owe them anything more than what a good mother should owe them. I talk to them about, honestly, sometimes I've said, your father and I wanted you so much that,
Mm.
but it's not to put any pressure on them about that they have to be a certain way because of that. But I did talk about that briefly to them in an age appropriate manner. But I do think that I haven't processed a lot of this trauma, which I did recently. I think I'm doing therapy just to be able to talk about these things, other things that have affected and impacted me now in my life, which I'm beginning to acknowledge that actually, even though this persona of being strong that I've created, and the fact that I'm not influenced by anything or affected by anything, and you just move on, is not the best approach, because I have to tackle and deal with it if I have to move forward, not for anybody else's sake, but for my own sake and
Mm.
mental health and my own physical health, that I have to acknowledge that things have been hard and it has had an impact or toll on me. And I think what you're doing and about acknowledging that is, I think, is a huge thing. To be able to say that I'm changing because of this process, I think is a really important thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for sharing that. Obviously, these are not like easy things to talk about. But so you also write about in the book menopause. And actually, when you were going through your fertility journey, you were told that you were going through early menopause. And you describe it in the book as this signifier of decline. And I have been really pleasantly surprised to see there be a shift generally in terms of how we are talking about menopause and just the fact that we are talking about it. But again, still, I would say not massively within the South Asian community. But I can only imagine, because you were told that you were going through early menopause during your fertility journey, and then not long after you became a mother and were thrown into the new motherhood of not just one baby but two. So I can only imagine that was absolutely manic. Did you have time to really process that your body was also going through this menopausal change? Or yeah, what was that like?
No, I didn't. And I didn't even think about it. And I didn't even have time, as you say, to think about myself
Mm.
because I think very rightly the focus has to be on the children. And in our healthcare domain, the focus is on the children and the babies. You're a cursory kind of and a side thing issue, but also I never really thought about menopause that much and wasn't really this active around menopause. People weren't talking about it. I never talked to my mother about menopause. In fact, I talked to her recently and she told me about, oh, that time when we went to that wedding, I think I was going through that. And I was like, I didn't know about it because she never mentioned it.
Mm.
Even with three daughters, she never talked about it, which is such a shame that she went through it alone. Loneliness, again, we come back to that. But also I didn't, and for a few years I didn't even. And later on, when I started thinking about it, when the children were a little bit older, I was like, I went to the doctor and she asked me, when did your period stop? And I had to stop and think about it because I couldn't even remember
Mm.
my it's like my body wasn't my own for all those early years,
Mm.
especially because the children were in and out of hospitals, they had other complications and things like that. So I wasn't thinking about myself and my body again and again. I think the lack of information and knowledge is a huge barrier because now we have books and now we're talking about it, but this is like 2018, and even then 19 we didn't talk much about it. So yeah, I think it's only recently and a few years ago. And even when I went to the GP, I wasn't sure whether it's just parenting or the exhaustion of young motherhood, new motherhood, or is it anything to do with menopause? And I would tell the doctor, and they would say, oh, actually, I didn't need anything. And there was a huge reluctance around giving me anything for it. And I had to badger the nurse into actually giving me HRT patches. But then I went through other things last year where I had to stop them. So now I don't know whether it is menopause or is it exhaustion? Is it just work or is it something seriously wrong with my body? So I don't know. So yeah, that's a huge issue about when we don't. I think sometimes you don't feel an ownership of your own bodies. It's like this thing is happening. You just pass through it. You don't have time to consider your body. But if you do have time to, and you think about your bodies, then you become, I think there's that internalized notion that you're thinking too much about yourself, or that you're being selfish, or there's a lot of focus on yourself, or you're being in hypochondriac, for instance. There's an internalized, still, we have internalized a lot of these messages.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think as well, we've internalized also that like menopause is the end of like our fertile life, and there's so many different connotations with what that means. And it's really awful when we think about it, because it's okay if that means that I don't have reproductive fertility, but the word fertile
Yeah.
is also so positive and hopeful. And then we start using either infertile or not fertile, and it's okay, am I not alive, am I
Yeah.
dead, am I dull? There's so many different associations and connotations with that again are internalized. I don't think we even realize that we do it. And yeah,
Also,
really.
I think in certain cultures and communities, I know from my own culture and community, there is a very this kind of mark about old age and when you become older. And I think it very early on, after 40, people are like old, or women in particular. You're now an old
Mm.
person, basically. And I used to tell my dad, "You're not old," and he was like, "Of course I am old." No, look at all these people who are doing all these things. What does old age mean? And I think that perception of what old age means and what it signifies and what things you can do and not do after that is also very much culturally determined as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that starts
Yeah.
like way younger, when there's almost like a focus or an obsession to be married or in a serious relationship by a certain age and having children by a certain age. And the biggest myth, I think, is this, or I don't know if it's a myth, but this like hyper focus on the fact that you only have up until you're 35 and then your fertility drops off a cliff. Like, that's the way that we're told. And it's so many women, myself included. Like, I remember when I was turning 30, I was an absolute anxious mess, and I was just like, oh my gosh, the world's gonna end, like I'm never gonna have children. And then I woke up on my 30th birthday and I was like, oh, everything's fine. The world is still as it was yesterday. That will be okay. But it's so like that pressure, again, that pressure that's put on women, some of it is put on by ourselves because we internalize it from the world around us. It's what we are told when we're very young, in so many different ways. And actually, your latest book is about the myth of gendered emotions, which I haven't read, but I love the topic of gendered emotions because I've been thinking a lot over the last few years about the emotion of rage and how for so long girls and women are told that this is not a feminine emotion. Like, it's ugly. If you are being angry, you're being told that you're difficult or you're unpleasant or it's not nice, whatever it is. But rage is so valid. And just as we wrap up for today, I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on that book and that particular topic and what you really hope people will think about when it comes to emotion and gender.
Yeah, I think it was really something that I was thinking about for quite a long time, about how we associate femininity and masculinity with certain emotions, about how men can't cry or women can't show anger, or even this. I would just give one example. In this experiment they did, where they showed traditionally masculine or feminine faces to people showing anger as an expression. They were asked to comment on it, and both men and women thought the women who were showing anger was just an angry person, while for men they thought, oh, he's having a bad day. So it becomes very quickly associated with their personality. And so the book is all about the history, the science of how these emotions become gendered through the ages. But today, what is the impact of it in terms of the gender equality or women's situation, position in medicine, in leadership and politics, and everything like that. So yeah, and hysterical is such a word that's weaponized against women, against valid emotions. So thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think it's been such a lovely conversation, Samia. And
thank you, Pragya, and thank you so much for being so open and willing to share so much as well. And I really hope that this episode will find its listeners in the way that your books are finding its readers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Samia.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.